think it's on. Hello? No, it's not on. Debbie is coming. Let's flag her down. How does it turn on? Is that on my phone? No, I don't know. Hello? Doesn't sound like it's
does
on.
not seem on to me.
Oh.
Oh, look, they jumped over there. That's good.
Oh, great. Elena, look. Megan is our number one fan.
No, seriously. The lighting in here truly is awful, though. Try again?
Try again.
Yeah, you're just speaking to it.
Hello? I don't think it's not working, right?
No, I don't think it'll. Try. No.
I don't think it's on.
Keep trying.
I don't think it's on.
Can you speak louder?
I can speak loud.
Silicon Valley.
Is there a way to turn it on? No, right? I think they turn it on from up there. Oh. Should I just speak?
Hey everybody, welcome.
Ah, there we go. That's
Does this one work? Testing? No.
No.
Looks like there are a lot of...
Silicon Valley.
Hello?
Testing.
Is this one? No. Still
Mine
not
doesn't
on?
work either, right?
Oh, no, I don't think yours is working either.
Anything is on.
We just want to get the show on the road.
Somebody's trying to help us, right?
I hope so.
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
No, not on yet?
Try the other one.
Over there. This man is trying this one.
1, 2, 3, 4. 4, 3, 2, 1. Nope.
This is a terrible showing. How did this happen?
I can talk loudly enough for everybody here, but but I'm
4,
not
4, 4.
lecturing. I'm not lecturing. We gotta get a microphone to work. There's some seats down here in front if anybody wants to.
1, 2, 3, 4. Nope.
We can just
Testing.
Not on this
Testing.
one
No.
I don't know. No, I can project.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Project our voices.
Test. 1, 2.
We need to
Nope.
have some microphones.
But
Yeah,
you
that
need a
one.
microphone to work, at least.
Should I go back? Seems like something much.
1, 2, 3, 4.
We'll project. Go ahead.
Nope. 0 for 6.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, use it. Why don't you
1, 2, 3, 4. 4, 4, 4. 4, 4.
Hi, everyone.
Nope. All right.
Sorry, I'm gonna try it without the microphone, but no, it's not working for us. Oh, okay. Okay, we'll wait a little longer.
1, 2, 3, 4. 4, 4, 4. 4, 4, 4, 4.
See people scurrying around.
Yeah.
Usually they do mic checks before these things.
1, 2, 3, 4.
They didn't do that.
Hey,
I
people
just don't
One.
understand how it's not
I
working.
don't either.
Nope, still not.
Still nothing. I think that there's something down here that's not on.
I don't know. I
Or
can't.
around back here.
I don't know anything
I'm just
about
not a tech
technology.
person.
Where's what's happening?
It's not. Just say like the. None of them microphone. None of them are.
Test. 1, 2.
Oh. Thank you for holding with us during our technical difficulties. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our book talk with Ambassador Susan Rice. My name is Natasha Mulji. I'm currently a senior studying economics and political science. This year, I'm the chair of Stanford in Government, which is the largest nonpartisan organization on Stanford's campus. We work to promote policy as public service, as well as foster political discourse. Before we get started, a few thanks are in order. The first is to FSI for putting on this incredible event and for allowing us to co-sponsor, so thank you so much, FSI. And the second is to the namesake of the lecture. The S.T. Lee Lectureship is named for Sang T. Lee, a business executive and noted philanthropist. Dr. Lee is director of the Lee Group of companies in Singapore and of the Lee Foundation. Dr. Lee endowed the annual lectureship at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies in order to raise public understanding of the complex policy issues facing the global community today and to increase support for informed international cooperation. The S.T. Lee Distinguished Lecturer is chosen for his or her international reputation as a leader in international political, economic, social, and health issues and strategic policymaking concerns. To get us started, I'll be introducing our evening's moderator, Ambassador McFall. Ambassador McFall is the Director and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, Professor of International Studies and Political Science, and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute, all at Stanford University. He joined the Stanford faculty in 1995 and is also an analyst for NBC News and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. Ambassador McFall served for 5 years in the Obama administration, first as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russian and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council at the White House from 2009 to 2012, and then as U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2012 to 2014. He has authored several books, including most recently the New York Times bestseller From Cold War to Hot Peace, An American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. He's currently writing a book on great powers relations in the 21st century.
Thank you, Natasha. My name is Elena Crespo, and this year I am Stanford and Government's Vice Chair for Programming. As you all know, our distinguished guest of the evening is Ambassador Susan Rice, and before she joins us on stage, I'll tell you a little bit about her background. Ambassador Susan Rice is currently the Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at the School of International Service, American University, and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Previously, Ambassador Rice served President Barack Obama as National Security Advisor and U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. In her role as National Security Advisor from July 2013 to January 2017, she was responsible for coordinating and for the formulation and implementation of all aspects of the administration's foreign and national security policy, including all diplomatic, intelligence, homeland security, and military efforts. As U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations and a member of President Obama's cabinet from 2009 to 2013, Rice worked to advance U.S. interests, defend universal values, strengthen the world's security and prosperity, and promote respect for human rights. Ambassador Rice served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs from 1997 to 2001. In that role, she formulated and implemented U.S. policy towards 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and was responsible for the management of all U.S. embassies and more than 5,000 U.S. and Foreign Service national employees. Rice received her master's degree and PhD in international relations from New College, Oxford University, England, where she was a Rhodes Scholar alongside Ambassador McFall. Ambassador Rice received her BA in history with honors from Stanford University in 1986, where she was Junior Phi Beta Kappa and a Truman Scholar. A native of Washington, D.C., Ambassador Rice is married to Ian Cameron, Stanford class of '83, and they have 2 children. She's an avid tennis player and retired basketball player. She recently published her memoir, Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. And after the event, books will be available for purchase on stage, and Ambassador Rice will be signing them. Here to discuss that memoir, please welcome Ambassador Mike McFall and Ambassador Susan Rice to the stage.
Hey, Susan.
Hey, Mike.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the farm.
Thank you. It's great to be back. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight.
So I actually read the book.
Thank you.
Okay?
I appreciate that.
And as a good student,
My
I want
friend
to.
and classmate actually read the book.
I have lots of earmarks and things here, and I just want to say, first of all, I think you compare writing a book to giving birth. I only know one of those two events in life, but it is hard to write a good book. It's really hard to write a fantastic book, and this is a fantastic book.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about some of the substance, but I also just want to tell you, aesthetically, it's a really terrific book. I read a lot. I write a lot. I read a lot of mediocre Stanford papers, and I read a lot of great papers, and this is really great writing. And the other thing I want to say to everybody here, there's one thing you have to do before you leave tonight, and you have to buy this book. I don't care how you do it. You know, if you want to do it on your phone, don't do that now. Do it that way. Come and stand in line and get it signed. But if you don't buy this book, then books like this don't get written. And I just implore you, we need books like this to be written. We need to know the history, and we need to know the history of people like Susan Rice. So buy this book, and I'm going to guarantee you in the next 45 minutes, we're going to give you even more reasons to buy this book, okay?
Amen. Can I take you on the road with me? That's good stuff.
For a fee.
All right.
Let's start with some easy questions, and we'll get to some harder ones. And I'm going to bounce around, by the way. This book is a narrative, but I want to bounce around about things that were most interesting to me. But let's start with just some basic things. First, explain the title, Tough Love.
Tough love is how I was raised by my parents. It's how I've, with my husband, tried to raise our kids. And it's also how I've tried to serve our country and lead teams. To me, tough love means loving fiercely, but not uncritically. And so, you know, if you love somebody, you love them enough to give them the hard truths and to draw them up short and tell them where they can improve. And some of the most valuable personal and professional relationships I've had have been ones in which I've been the recipient of tough love. So it encompassed very thoroughly many aspects of my personal and professional life. And this is very much, in many ways, a personal book. It's
extremely personal and extremely honest.
And it's raw in parts, and it goes back to my parents and grandparents, my childhood, some of the very difficult aspects of my childhood, and then on through my professional life. And as I wrestled with finding a title, as many of us do, this one really grabbed me as capturing the totality of my experience.
And tell us a little bit about the second part. What are the things worth fighting for?
So everybody has things that they think are worth fighting for, I hope. For me, it was very much, in the first instance, family. And secondly, education and equality, which are key foundations that underlay how I was raised and the family that I came from. And I think in the current context, as I write towards the end of the book, what we need to fight for is our national unity and the preservation of our democracy.
We'll come back to that towards the end. You know, it's a memoir, and it goes back and forth between your history and policy things, and we're going to do the same tonight. But why write this book now? You're not done yet. You're awful young, because you're younger than me.
Only by like 1 year, man.
Okay, only by 1 year, but why now? And why not wait 20, 30 years from now to write the similar book?
That's a really fair question. I think all things being equal, I might have waited. Not because I necessarily expect to have, you know, more history of U.S. foreign policy to write.
Well, we do, just so you know.
But to be very candid, I felt, as I served in the Obama administration, and in particular after 2012, when I became a much more public figure than I ever aspired to be, after my appearances on the Sunday shows following the attacks in Benghazi. I felt that I'd been characterized and mischaracterized. I'd been depicted by one side as a villain and by other side as, either a victim or some kind of heroine. And none of that bore any resemblance to who I was, where I came from, what I care about.
Right.
And I was compelled as a senior administration official and public servant to speak only on behalf of our country and on behalf of the president, which was my job, and I accepted it, and that was the right thing to do, but I couldn't in any way, shape, or form tell my own story in my own words. And
this was your
so
shot.
It was something I felt a need to do, not only for myself, but more importantly, I hope for other people, because I've had extraordinary opportunities. I come from a unusual background in some respects, the descendants of slaves on one side, the descendants of immigrants from Jamaica on the other, and with parents who came from very trying circumstances and rose to extraordinary success and instilled in me and my brother a lot of very valuable lessons about how to compete and thrive in unforgiving environments, and if you're knocked down, to get back up. And I wanted to share that experience and some of those lessons. So that's why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to write it sooner rather than later for the reasons that I described, and and before somebody else tried to write my story for me.
Well, that's a good point. Get ahead of the curve on that, because you'll tell it the way you want to, for sure, better than anybody else. It was striking to me and surprising to me how much time Susan spends in this book. Ambassador Rice.
Just
she's
come
Susan
on, man,
to me.
you're ambassador. We're going to do all that?
Yeah.
Come on.
You can call me His Excellency if you want.
No. Mike.
Mike. Susan doesn't show up until page 48 in this book. That was really striking to me. You spend a lot of time.
Is that true?
Yeah, I got it marked right here.
That's interesting.
And because you obviously wanted to tell the story of your family, and then she tells the story of her nuclear family now, but that was striking to me. What was behind the decision to put so much time into that before you arrived?
Well, first of all, I hadn't observed that until you mentioned it. So
I'll check my
well,
facts.
the prologue is an exception, because I do situate. The book begins on the last day of the Obama administration, actually January 20th, 2017, and with my, time in the White House between 9 in the morning and just before the stroke of noon, when there was the changing of the guard. So the prologue does have some me in it.
Yeah.
But
you're born on page 48.
I'm born on page 48. Okay.
By the way, a fact that I did not know, my first brother was stillborn.
Yeah.
It's also on page 48. And you didn't know that till you were 12 years old.
That's right.
But back
Okay,
to
but back to
piece,
the.
yeah,
So
yeah.
the reason why I spend time on my family history, my parents, my grandparents, and actually in the case of my father's side of the family, my great-grandfather,
Right.
who was a slave in South Carolina. He fought in the Union Army after emancipation. And after the end of the Civil War, a white soldier, a white officer, gave him the opportunity to get a basic education in Massachusetts. And then he came back to South Carolina. He was a teacher. He ultimately got his divinity degree from Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, and then went on to found a school in New Jersey called the Bordentown School, which for 70 years, from the late 1880s to just after Brown versus the Board of Education in 1955, educated generations of African Americans, not only in vocational and technical skills, but in college preparatory courses. And this Bordentown School in New Jersey attracted Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Mary McLeod Bethune. I mean, I go all the way back to him and then my parents and grandparents, because their history and their experience truly defines who I am. As the granddaughter of immigrants from Jamaica who went to Portland, Maine in 1912 with literally nothing, no education, but just the hunger and the ambition that so many immigrants bring to this country. My grandfather was a janitor. My grandmother was a maid, and they had 5 children, and they saved and they scraped, and they sent all 5 of their kids to college.
Ford
And
Bowden.
my grandfather was the first man to have 4 sons attend Bowdoin. 2 became doctors, 1 a university president, 1 an optometrist, and then my mother, the youngest, who couldn't go to Bowdoin because she was a girl, this is in 1950, ended up having to go to some lesser school called Radcliffe. And she went on to be a pioneer in the field of higher education and higher education finance. She was known as the mother of the Pell Grant because she was instrumental in the establishment and the sustainment of the Pell Grant program, which enabled 80 million Americans, has enabled to date 80 million Americans to
Including me, by the way.
go to college.
When I read that, I owe a lot to Susan. I would never have worked in the Obama administration if not for Susan Rice. But I now know that I also owe my Stanford education to her mother because of the Pell Grant. So that was great to read.
So anyway, and I could talk about my dad. My dad, just briefly, was born in segregated South Carolina around 1920 with the huge weight and oppression of Jim Crow and the height of lynching. And yet, as the son and the grandson of college-educated African-American men, he had ambition and he had capacity and the hope that he could go on to excel, and yet the burden of racism was so omnipresent for him. He served at Tuskegee with the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II and eventually made his way out to Berkeley just after the war to get his PhD in economics. And their experiences as immigrants, as the descendants of slaves, as people who rose from little to achieve a lot, were completely instrumental in making me who I am. So I had to go back there to
Give them their due.
well, not just to give them their due, but to explain who I am and
you
why
Right.
I am the way I am, for better or worse.
Let's talk about one quote from your mom and one from your dad. On page 57, you write about your mom, and you you write that she demonstrated that, quote, career and family need not be a binary choice for women. And later, talking about yourself, page 218, I have footnotes. You write, motherhood also made me a better policymaker. And I know everybody in this room will agree in theory. Everybody aspires to that. But it sounds hard. Help us understand how we can believe it. And let me quote another passage from page 357, writing about your deputy, Avril Haines. You report that she almost never left the office before midnight, and often much later. That sounds hard to manage. Tell us how you did it and how you do it.
Well, first of all, my mother was an extraordinary role model. She was a working mom and a very successful professional from basically the time I was born, and as soon as she was done with maternity leave. And she did show me that it was possible to do both. And that, in an era where so many of the parents of and the mothers of my peers were not working.
Not working.
And, the working women that I knew were, in addition to my mother, who went on to, who were great successes, were Madeleine Albright and Alice Rivlin, these extraordinary titans who excelled in their fields. And so they really were proof that it was possible while raising kids. But when I say that motherhood made me a better policymaker, I say that because, one, it gave me perspective. It gave me a long view. It gave me a passion about the consequences of our decisions. It made it really tangible. I recognized that, when we were talking about climate change or, non-proliferation, these things mattered to my kids and to my grandchildren I hope to have. And
did you hear that, Jake? John, I
whatever. We'll call him Jake. And anonymize him. Anyway, the other thing is that having kids, and you know this, Mike, it puts everything in perspective. If you have the worst possible day at work and you feel like whatever you do, everything's crashing down on you, and you just feel despairing, going home and holding a child and reading a bedtime story and knowing that they need you more than anything is just the most, bombing salve you can come up with.
Yeah.
It just made so much easier. And yes, Avril's crazy. I mean, let's say, I love her. I love her. She's the best possible deputy one could have. She worked the hardest job in government, harder than I've ever seen anybody work
It's
it.
the Deputy National Security Advisor is the job that runs the Deputies Committee.
And in part,
Susan writes about it in the book.
She was, I think, able and willing to do that because she didn't have
Right.
kids to come home to.
Right.
And so, that's what's another benefit of having kids. They are a disciplining function.
Right.
You do want to get yourself home if you possibly can before they go to bed. Many times you won't make it, but you sure as hell are trying.
It's on your mind. Let's talk about your dad and a couple more things, then we'll shift to policy, don't worry. But I found the beginning of the book, which actually, the theme, by the way, runs throughout the book. It's all intertwined. That's why it's such a great read. On page 68, he says, "Don't take crap off of anyone." Explain the importance of that phrase.
That
to
is
you.
my father's seminal life lesson. There are many in here. There are many in here about.
I've never seen anybody give you crap, by the way. I would not want to see that person, but go ahead and explain.
Well, let's talk about a few who try in the
Well,
book,
you did.
and it
You
didn't
did.
end well.
That's true. That is true. There is a story in the. Well, you tell the story about Holbrooke. I had heard this story about Holbrooke. I just thought it
Did
was
these
some
people
lore.
know what we're talking about?
No, I
Okay.
had heard about this. I kid you not, Susan. I thought that was just one of these made-up stories that builds and builds and builds about the badassness of Susan Rice, but it turns out it was true. So maybe tell that story.
Okay, so the predicate here is my father, as he learned to overcome racism. We should talk a little bit about his views
Yes.
on race, but I won't
Yes.
divert from the Holbrooke story for the moment. But he determined that the only way he could thrive and succeed was to believe in himself, know his own value, and literally not take crap off of anybody. If somebody was trying to diminish him or dismiss him or define him for him or tell him that he can't or bully him, he would push back. He wouldn't take it. And that's
Right.
what he taught me and my brother. So fast forward to when I am probably 33, 34, a young assistant secretary of state for African affairs, a job I started when I was 32,
The youngest assistant secretary ever.
regional assistant
it,
secretary, and
regional.
I was the brand new mother of a 3-month-old child and a breastfeeding mother in the State Department. And the bulk of the people who worked with me and reported to me as ambassadors or senior officials were 20 to 30 years my senior, and predominantly white men, and mostly career, but not entirely, State Department officials. So that's context that's relevant to the story. So Richard Holbrooke, who many of you will have heard of, at this stage, when I'm assistant secretary, he had been just nominated to be U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And his nomination had been held up for some months. He clearly was restless. And one day, I'm up on Capitol Hill meeting with members of Congress, and my huge cell phone rings. That's back in the day when these things were like the size of bricks. And it's my secretary on the phone saying, Ambassador Holbrooke is in your office, and he's insisting that you come back right now to meet with him. And I said, well, can you please tell him I'm up on the Hill meeting with members of Congress, and I can't upend my schedule to come back and meet him. Tell him to schedule an appointment. And she says, I don't think he's leaving. So I said, okay, well, make sure he doesn't take anything. Keep a close eye on him. And I'll see him when I get back. So I come back to my office about an hour and a half later, and there he is, sitting on my couch. He probably had his feet on my coffee table, but I don't remember that precisely. But that was his sort of general posture. And I'd never met him before. And I sit down, and having shaken his hand, and I said, what's so urgent that you have been sitting in my office waiting for me that we couldn't schedule an appointment? And the first thing that he said to me was, I dislike you already. Because you broke my record as the youngest regional assistant secretary of state. And our relationship went downhill from there. So maybe a year later, when he actually is UN ambassador, he decides to convene a summit of leaders from Central Africa, 6 or 7 countries. And he's literally summoning Robert Mugabe and Yoweri Museveni and all these people to New York. And of course, as UN ambassador, he doesn't have the standing to chair the meeting with these heads of state. So he asked Secretary Albright to do it. And he also then, therefore, calls back the ambassadors from these Central African countries who report to me. Right. And one Sunday afternoon, after he demands a meeting in his office with me, all the ambassadors who report to me from the region, a few of my staff, and a few of his staff, where he's lording over the table and we're engaging in a very robust policy argument. It's going back and forth, and it's quite intense. And I finally, after letting my ambassadors weigh in, I say my piece, which happened to differ markedly from his point of view. And he leans over the table, very hulking, large man, and dripping with sarcasm, he says, I remember when I, too, was a young assistant secretary. And words failed me, but my middle finger didn't. So I expressed my dismay, and in my father's fashion, didn't take crap off of him, but I had 2 immediate concerns. One was that one of our most distinguished ambassadors, this wonderful man named Bill Swing, who had served in 6 countries. I thought he was going to have a coronary. So all I could do was pray for him. But the second concern was, I better go tell my bosses in Washington what had happened before he can. So I let a few minutes pass, and I step out, and I call Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And I say, Madam Secretary, I'm calling to report that I just gave the finger to a member of the president's cabinet. And she said, tell me more. I gave her the whole story, and at the end she said words to the effect of, you go, girl. So that's a true story.
Great story. He was a force of nature. How about that for a diplomatic thing? So let's move a little bit forward. Let's talk about Stanford a little bit. You write in your book, and this is for all the Stanford students who are stressed out about their midterms or something happening in their lives right now. You write, Stanford was as close to heaven as I have ever come. Explain that sentence, and how did Stanford shape who you are, and how would it have been different had you gone to, say, Yale or Harvard?
Who'd want to go to Yale or Harvard when you can go to Stanford? I was just ahead of our time in making that judgment. Stanford was look at this place. It's beautiful. You're not going to freeze your behind off in the middle of winter, and often in May and October. It's got everything you could possibly want here. And I'm glad you asked that question, because what little insight we have as parents of undergraduates would lead us to observe that people are not having enough fun here. They are not recognizing that this really will be one of the best times of your life, unless you waste it or spend too much time stressing out and not taking advantage of all that's here. But I think in our day, it was a little bit less intense. And, I learned an extraordinary amount, not just in the classroom, but from the students I met, and from, somebody who grew up on the East Coast in, the intense elitist environment in Washington, and with the expectation that, one is supposed to go to the best possible Ivy League school you can go to.
Right.
I decided to come out here, and it just exposed
And that
me
wasn't
to.
popular in your family.
It wasn't
initially, right?
popular with my mother.
With your mother, that's right.
The
your mother.
Radcliffe one.
Yeah.
She had some
Yeah, your father won.
naive
He's a Berkeley
perceptions
guy.
about how great it was out here. My father, who'd been to Berkeley, he was cool. He understood. But anyway, this is an extraordinary place. And in the time that you will have here, and for me, the exposure to the West Coast, to the Pacific, to the history and culture of this part of the world was really quite eye-opening. And I made wonderful friends that I've kept to this day. And my only regret, frankly, is that I only had 4 years. I wish I'd had an extra time and could have, and one of my...
Well, we have a mid-career program.
Yeah,
You can come back.
I was going to say, one of my secret dreams is to come back and take the courses I never
You're always
got
welcome.
to take.
And you met some guy from South America you write about, right?
Oh, yeah. That's another thing that made Stanford great. I forgot about that. I met my husband, and he's here tonight, and we met first week of my freshman year.
Wow.
All right, so here's this story. I'll tell this one quickly. He was a senior, I was a freshman. We lived in Soto, a 4-class dorm.
That romantic place called Soto.
Oh, yeah.
Soto's here. Okay, I'm sorry. Go Soto! What is it? Yeah, right.
First week of school, the upperclassmen throw an ice cream social for the freshmen. And I see this really cute guy across the room. I was not, frankly, trying to get into a relationship. I just come from 9 years in an all-girls school. And I get out here, and it's like Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, all wrapped up in one. And I just I was just trying to take it all in, right?
Keep going, keep going. Don't dwell on that. Push on through. Let me tell the story about British Columbia
So anyway,
while you're recovering.
this was figuratively, obviously. Anyway, so I meet this guy, and he's really nice and comes up and introduces himself. And he asks me where I'm from. And I say, well, I'm from Washington, D.C. Where are you from? And he says, I'm from British Columbia. And I pause, and I'm thinking to myself, where on God's green earth is British Columbia? And I'm trying to do some deductive reasoning, and so I think, okay, there's French Guiana, there's British Guiana, and there's Colombia. So I say, is that in South America? And he looks at me like I'm the biggest idiot he'd ever met. And we've been married 27 years. Not counting the 10 years before we got married. So it's been about 37 years of this. And the more I rose in the diplomatic ranks, the more mileage he got out of that story of my geographic deficits.
Well, you guys have an extraordinary relationship, partnership, marriage, and it's all documented here. It's really something special. And for young people trying to figure out how you make two careers work and make family work, it's really touching the way you write about your relationship with Ian. And it's great that he's here tonight. I've been taking too long. I want to get to questions at about 8 o'clock, just to warn people, because I know there'll be lots of questions. I still have lots, and I'm going to keep going if you don't mind. Let's go quickly through Clinton, and then let's get to Obama, okay? You already touched on this a little bit, but you joined the Clinton White House right at the NSC for for the first term, and then second term you were the youngest assistant secretary. Was that too fast when you look at it in retrospect? You talk a little bit about recalibrating a conversation you had with Howard Wolpe, right?
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken.
Was
What do you
it
think
too
about that?
fast? It was early.
Early maybe is a better word.
I was young. It's when you're 28 years old working at the White House in a policy role on the National Security Council staff, that's young. But I was really fortunate because I had mentors who really took an interest in me.
Yeah, that really
my
comes out
first-
in the book, by the way.
My first boss on the NSC staff was a man named Richard Clark, who had enormous long tenure and experience in government, and he's became well known as the counterterrorism czar and now cybersecurity expert. And he taught me the ropes, along with Randy Beers and some others. And how to write a good memo to the president, how to run an interagency process, where to find money in the budget. And so for 6 months, I was essentially in an intensive tutorial under their extraordinary leadership, and they helped me learn the ropes. And I also had National Security Advisor Tony Lake, Deputy National Security Advisor Sandy Berger. These were people who took an interest in me and gave me guidance and gave me opportunities. And so fast forward 4 years later, when I get to the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State, having also moved up to run the Africa office at the NSC. In the interim, I was 32 years old, this young mother, but in an environment where the people who I was working with were just light years more experienced than I, and that was a hugely challenging transition.
Right.
Because even though I had the policy knowledge at that point and a good sense of how to move and run the process and the support of the Secretary of State and the President, these people at the State Department didn't know me really from Adam. And to the extent they did know me, they knew me as the hard-edged, pushy senior director for African affairs who was, in their knickers too much. Mm-hmm. So it was a real transition to get to the State Department and establish an effective leadership role. And there were many people, I think, who, I guess, resented my role, thought I was too young, not sufficiently experienced. And there were others that were at least willing to give me the benefit of the doubt, but it was still a real challenge. And I think I had a lot of the raw capacity to do it, but not enough of the seasoning. And so in my early years, but especially my first year, where we had all kinds of things go wrong. We had war in the Congo. We had war break out between Ethiopia and Eritrea. We had evacuations of multiple embassies. And then we had our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania attacked by al-Qaeda. This is 1998. And my approach to dealing with these simultaneous crises was just to push through and to be focused on the task and to just drive to results to the extent that I could. And I was invited out to lunch right before Christmas at the end of my first year by a wonderful man named Howard Wolpe. He was a former congressman from Michigan who chaired the Africa subcommittee in the House, and he was now working with me in the Africa Bureau as President Clinton's special envoy for Central Africa. And he took me out to a really crappy Chinese restaurant nearby the State Department. You probably know the Magic Gorge.
I do, yeah.
Don't eat there. But, really a few bites into the meal, he says to me, Susan, you're going to fail in this job unless you correct course. You're smart, you're hard driving, you've got great policy vision, but you're too impatient. You're not sufficiently respectful of and solicitous of the views and experiences of others. You're not building support and team around you. You're just, driving like a, a jackhammer towards your intended outcome. And if you don't change, you're going to fail, and I don't want to see you fail. Great example of tough love.
Right.
And it was critical to enabling me to learn and to grow and to change and to become a more effective leader, to learn that leadership is a team sport, not an individual sport.
Right.
And I got there, but not without making some mistakes along the way. And I think by the time I finished my tenure, not particularly old, still like 36 or something, I had become a much more effective leader and manager. And had it not been for him, quite honestly, I'm not sure I would have gotten there. And so I was young, and it was a risk. I said to Madeleine Albright recently, because she did what you're doing now, she interviewed me at one stop on my book tour, and I said, Madeleine, you know, if I were you, knowing now what I didn't know then, I'm not sure I would have given me that job. And she said, well, but you did it, and you did it well, and I knew you would. But it was a challenge, and you know, it taught me to fail, and first time to get knocked down and get back up.
But by failing, you get to succeed again in the future. We'll get to. I better get to that quickly. I apologize. There's so much interesting here to talk to you about. One last question. This actually is about both the Clinton years, and the Obama years. There are many times when I'm reading this history, and some of it I lived through with you for 5 years in the government. And you know, as a professor, I teach about diplomacy and foreign policy, and this argument about structures versus agents. And sometimes things happen on your watch that you don't have any control of, that you have to react to, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. As I was reading your book, we were celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall here over at Hoover, and I literally, I think, almost the same day was reading about you were dealing with Rwanda at the same time that another young NSC, I think she was still director, maybe senior director, named Rice, was dealing with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It happened on her watch. So
Not at the same time, temporally.
1989. No.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, I'm garbling this, which is to say, you know, you look like a hero when the Berlin Wall falls on your watch. You can be described as a villain when Rwanda happens on your watch. And how do you both, because you're a historian, right? How do you assess the difference between, you know, responding, you write about it, the crush of crises is the phrase that you have, versus keeping the affirmative agenda going? That seems like, for me, that was one of the hardest things to do in government.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, Rwanda is really not the best example in my case because I was a junior staffer and I wasn't even working yet on Africa. I had the UN portfolio, but I had a first row seat on that. But years later, like take when I'm National Security Advisor, and we're dealing with, you know, Snowden and Syria and Ukraine and Afghanistan and, you know, you name it, the whole long list of things that you don't ask for that happen to you, the Ebola epidemic.
Right.
And my first 2 years as National Security Advisor really felt like an unbelievable crush of crisis. And we also had a lot of things we wanted to get done, what we very directly called the Affirmative Agenda. You know, we wanted to see if we could effect an opening to Cuba. We wanted to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. We wanted a climate accord. We wanted to see if we could use the combination of diplomacy and pressure to achieve an Iran deal. And those are just a handful of examples. And then we had many things on the development agenda. We wanted to bring electrification to more parts of Africa. We wanted to train young leaders from Southeast Asia to Europe to Africa. There was just a whole number of things that constituted the affirmative agenda. And the way I found that we could manage both, and I think we did, was one, to be very conscious that if you just manage your inbox and the crush of crises, that could take all your time easily. Right. And yet you wouldn't be able to say that we put points on the board. We were just managing the inbox. And so what worked for us, and for me in particular, was to empower those parts of the NSC staff that weren't working on the crush of crises to go run with the pieces of the affirmative agenda and to empower them and tell them and come back and get the guidance and support you need as you need it. But we're trusting you. Here's the direction. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Go do it. And then the people who had to worry about Syria or Afghanistan, they did their thing. But it was like, a multi-instrument orchestra, each part playing its role, and some were playing, the melody, and others were,
Right.
playing the other part.
You use that metaphor, yeah. It's good. I
And
like it.
that was the only way we could really walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right. Well, related to that, and by the way, I really love the way you use that metaphor, points on the board. We won't go through it all right now. I think there were 17 major things in your penultimate chapter where they're very concrete things. And I somebody who also served in the Obama administration, these were things that got done. Tragically, some of them are being unwound. We're going to end with that in a minute.
Oh, man, that's a
but it's a
bummer.
very important thing you talk about. You did things. You weren't just in jobs, right? To do versus to be. And I took that as a really important lesson. But there's another complicated part of that where you balance, to use your own language, your pragmatic side and your realist side versus your commitment to human rights. And you say very affirmatively here and there, I'm a pragmatist, I'm a realist. But some of your actions don't sound like what I see Steve Krasner's here. He would probably not code it as realist actions. And in particular, I want to hear about Libya and Syria. Libya, you delivered those resolutions. We're now speeding forward when you're the UN ambassador. By the way, lots of resolutions. 1874, North Korea, 1929, Iran, 1970, 1973 on Libya. And you write, when you go to Libya, this is page 291, I was welcomed with warmth and joy, more warmth and joy than I have experienced before or since as a representative of the United States on foreign soil. That's in Libya. Your colleagues were saying...
This is before Benghazi, by the way.
This is before, we're going to get to Benghazi. This is before Benghazi. Oh, yeah, and your trip was before Benghazi. That's important. Some of your colleagues are saying, we have no dog in that fight. We have no strategic interest there. So that doesn't sound like a realist.
Well,
to me.
look,
So
I'm not...
help us understand the balance.
I'm not a, Morgenthau realist, okay? I am a pragmatic progressive. That's how I describe my
That's a good
political
label. I like that.
orientation.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it reflects my thinking on foreign policy. I have become, with age and experience, probably more pragmatic than idealistic. And yet, my view is the United States, when we can, ought to be a force for good, for our values, for democracy, for freedom, for respect for human rights, for the sanctity and the dignity of human life. And that's, to me, an important part of who we are. But there are times when our interests and our constraints militate against being able to do all that we might want to do.
Right.
And what I learned, and this is in the vein of, a dilemma that is a theme through the book, from Rwanda through Syria.
Absolutely, yes.
It's, what do you do in the cases where humanitarian intervention is contemplated or ought to be contemplated? And when and under what circumstances is it appropriate for the United States to intervene? And in Libya, I argued that we had the opportunity and the ability, when Gaddafi's forces were massing and moving down the highway in tens of thousands, to literally wipe out the civilian population of Benghazi, and that was what Gaddafi said his intent was, and he demonstrated through his prior actions his readiness to do that. I thought that we could, through the use of air power, with UN support and with Arab and NATO allies, protect civilians. And we were able to do that because this was a case of not a hot civil conflict yet, but a column of forces moving to take out a city, and we could take out those forces. And so that was a case where I argued that the benefits of involvement arguably outweighed the risks. I argued the opposite, frankly, in Syria. We could talk about that, but the bottom line is, my view is, just because we can't intervene everywhere doesn't mean that we shouldn't intervene anywhere. We should weigh in each instance the risks and the benefits to our interests and our values and make decisions that will not often be satisfactory.
Right.
You know, in Libya, I think we were right to intervene, but the United States and the UN and the Europeans and the Arabs and the Africans, we screwed up the aftermath.
Right.
Now, and I'd go into some depth about how I think we, failed to be adequately prepared to help a fractured society begin to put itself back together. I also say I don't know if we tried, if we would have succeeded, but we'll never know because we really didn't try.
Right.
And in Syria, we didn't intervene militarily with ground forces in the civil war on the side of the opposition to topple Assad. That was, the debate in shorthand that we repeatedly entertained in the Situation Room. And as painful as that decision that the president ultimately made again and again not to intervene with U.S. ground troops was, I actually think that was the right choice for the totality of our interests. Now, there are colleagues and friends and people I admire and respect who totally disagree with that. And it's, it's a fair and legitimate debate. But the point is, each instance is different, and
Right. There's not one box
there's
or
not
the
a
other.
cookie-cutter answer.
Right. So we got a little bit of a late start, and I want to make sure you sign a lot of books because I'm hoping a lot of people are going to buy books.
I can sign fast.
We will switch to questions no matter what in 4 minutes, okay? So if you have questions, and we'll go till 8:15, 8:20 if there's really big lines, just so everybody aware, so we can leave plenty of time
Okay.
for signing books. So 2 or 3 more questions. This is like a speed round, okay? We'll have to be faster. I have to be faster. Let's talk a little bit about Benghazi, and let's talk a little bit about polarization in our society, because you end on that. But as I read your last chapter, I pivoted back to just the horrors of Benghazi for you. And frankly, I didn't know how deep and horrible it was for you and your family and your daughter. Talk about it as you like. But as you already said, you were put on these shows as a good soldier, and you were reading from the talking points. I remember doing that when I was in the government. And you were called all kinds of horrible things. You were called a liar, Susan. And as you write about it really movingly on page 315, you say, I don't mind being disliked, but to have my integrity impugned and to be branded a liar hurt like nothing I had experienced before. Talk about that moment, because that moment for me was a moment of polarization, and where no matter how hard you all were trying, I was in Moscow at the time, it just didn't seem like the facts mattered. And then you get to the end, dividing bridges, where you have an appeal that is, to me, lovely about how we got to get back to facts and bridging divides. But I wonder, can we, especially given what you went through in Benghazi? So maybe tell us a little bit about Benghazi.
That's the lightning round?
This is the lightning round, yeah. All right, I'm failing. I'll just skip the rest of it. Well, I want to end on a higher note, so let's just do this one, then one last
All right.
question. You got to do lightning round. This is hard.
First of all, it was more than a moment. It was
Yes.
months and arguably years.
Right.
And it did feel like, in that hothouse, particularly of a political campaign, that the facts didn't matter. And we now have had 8 congressional investigations of Benghazi in all of its aspects, including the longest and most glorious, led by Trey Gowdy. And each of those investigations found that neither I nor anybody else in the administration deliberately misled the American people. But in that moment, and actually even in the wake of those findings, there are just some people who will never buy that
Right.
reality. And that's my reality from here on out. But, I can't do much about it. But it does underscore the essential point that I am making in the last chapter of the book, called Bridging the Divides. And I talk about how our domestic political divisions in my view, are our greatest national security vulnerability. They are preventing us from getting basic things done. For example, building infrastructure so that we can be competitive with China and others in the 21st century. And they are giving our adversaries, as you know so well, like Russia, a huge opening to weaken us and defeat us from within. If the Russians can play on every side of every divisive issue, which they are every day of every week, and pit Americans against each other on the basis of race or immigration or guns or gay rights, you name it, whatever the most divisive issues and hot button issues, then they can weaken us, diminish our leadership, discredit our democracy, defeat us potentially, without ever firing a bullet. So that's why I think these divisions are so urgent and important. And the good news is that they are a problem of our own creation. And therefore, they're a problem that we have the capacity to address. And for all of you who are students of history or have lived history, you know that we have been, as a nation, through far worse periods of division than we face now. We've been through a civil war and Reconstruction and the reaction against Reconstruction. We've been through 2 world wars followed by McCarthyism and Vietnam and the civil rights era, where students were being shot on campuses and people like me had dogs and water hoses sicked on them and our cities were burning down. That's not where we are today. And arguably, we've come through each of these periods unified and stronger. So we have the capacity to do this. And I talk in the book both from personal experience of having different political perspectives in my own family, where despite those differences, we have chosen to remain a loving, unitary, mutually supportive family, and to learn from each other's different perspectives, and to listen, and to argue, and to try to understand what motivates those differences. But at the end of the day, we have a choice as a family, which is either to let policy or political differences divide us and ruin us, or to stay whole and intact and mutually supportive. That's what we've chosen. That's what we've got to do on a national level. And it's not easy, but we have the capacity to do it. And I talk in the book about a whole series of steps that we can take, from the individual to education levels, to how we teach civics, to how we engage one another on campuses, and how we tolerate dissent or fail to tolerate dissent. I think there are a range of political reforms that we could embrace that would reduce the power of the extremes, and they get to money in politics and redistricting and ranked choice voting. And then there are things that we could do if we really were motivated that would be far bolder. But so I recommend that we very seriously consider mandatory national service. It's the old people cheering.
Sorry.
I'm joking. I said that's the old people cheering.
That's the old people.
I joke that everywhere I go, most people like this idea until I get on
With the
college
students.
campuses.
They got other ideas.
And so the mandatory national service would be everybody 18 to 22 in this country, citizen and non-citizen, having to spend 6 to 12 months living with, working with, cooperating with people from vastly different backgrounds. Rich kids, you don't get out of it. If you come from the South Bronx or you come from the Lakota Reservation, we're all in it together. And I think it's hugely important, working on projects that have collective benefit, whether it's reforestation or rebuilding inner city schools or laying broadband. And the reason I think that kind of initiative is so important is because it's really hard to hate somebody when you actually know them. And that's what I think this moment requires, or some equivalent. So I am, despite, or maybe because of what I've experienced, as, a once and former and future target, I'm very much of the view that we've got to find ways to get beyond this. And, it's not going to be easy, but I also think it's within our capacity to achieve. And that's why I've closed the book by saying, nobody's ever won by betting against the United States' capacity to grow and renew and change itself. And they would be foolish to start now. And I truly believe that.
That's great. Let's end on that. Take some questions.
All right.
So I kind of want to end on that, but
Yeah,
we did
questions.
promise some time for questions.
We did.
So fire away. If you could go to the microphones here. All I would ask, we have very limited time, so real quick questions. And I'm going to be able to detect if they're not questions right away. Sir, go ahead. And just tell us who you are so Susan
My name
who
is
she's
Jason
talking to.
Spires. I'm a transfer student to Stanford. I'd like to say that you are right. This place is magical. I ride my bike through the quad and I see people taking pictures of being here. And it's so magical to live in a place where you just, sorry.
This is good. You're right.
Sorry. My question had to be, I know you view Edward Snowden as a traitor.
I do.
However, when I look back at my life and things that's gone wrong in it, I look at what good came out of that. So, in all fairness, realizing that you think he's a traitor, what good came out of the Edward Snowden fiasco?
Well, I'm not sure I would ascribe it directly to him, but what evolved from that experience. And I go into some depth. I realize
does. She
that's some
addresses it.
strong language, and it's not language I throw around lightly. And I won't elaborate here on why I say that, but you can certainly read
That's
it.
why you need to buy the book.
What we did in the wake of the Snowden disclosures was a top-to-bottom wholesale review of how we collect and retain intelligence information. And there are many, many aspects to it. Most of it is in the public domain through a Presidential Decision Directive 28 that we issued in January of 2014. But I do believe that as a result of that process, we're far more able to warrant the protection of American citizens and even foreign nationals' information and data, that we are far more intentional about our targeting and collection and narrow in our targeting and collection. At least, let me be very careful and say that's how it was when I left the administration. I'm not in it now, so I can't be certain of where we are today.
Right.
But I think, we made a series of adjustments and changes as a result of that policy review that I think maintained our capacity to protect the American people and at the same time to give more credible assurances that we were doing it in a responsible and worthy way.
Great, sir.
I apologize for two questions.
How about one?
Why not air power used in Syria? And two, in the recent deposition, that buying Greenland took up a whole lot of NSC time. How?
I have no idea is the answer to your second question. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Your first question is an important one. Why not air power in Syria? We looked at that extensively. If the challenge was to take out a few runways or to take out some aircraft, yes, we could have done that. But that would not have accomplished the principal challenge, which was, Assad's capacity to kill his own people. That would have required, I'm afraid to acknowledge, a sort of wholesale removal a la Saddam Hussein. And that can only be accomplished with large quantities of ground forces. So we certainly looked at all kinds of air options. We looked at, no-fly zones. We looked at, safe zones for civilians, all of which could have helped on the margins at great cost, not financial cost only, but cost in terms of our assets. But it wouldn't have solve the fundamental problem, which is, a killer in Damascus that was going to kill until he couldn't anymore.
No.
Hi, my name is Samantha Thompson. I'm a sophomore here at Stanford, and me and my family actually come from Jamaica, so I resonate with a lot of what you said of how your parents grew you up. And something else that resonates with me is that you once mentioned how your parents taught you never to use your race as an excuse or an advantage. And so I would just like to know, as a Jamaican American student, how did you give respect to where you came from, so your race, your heritage, the fact that you were a minority in these spaces, without letting it overcome your identity and your success?
I haven't talked about my dad and what he taught me about race, right?
You haven't? Yeah, go
Okay,
ahead.
because I'm getting senile now that I've...
No, you were about to, and then I distracted you. It's my fault.
So
that
first
phrase
of
is
all-
on page 69, if I'm not mistaken. just
First
so
of
you
all,
know.
that's impressive. I'm very proud of who I am and where I come from, and that I'm the daughter of immigrants and descendants of slaves, and I have a very clear and proud sense of that background and the opportunities and the obligations that come with it. But what my father and mother, but especially my father, taught me from his experience growing up in segregated South Carolina is that bigotry is in large part a function of the bigot's own insecurity. And that if you understand that, then as the target of that bigotry, whether it's based on race or sex or gender or sexual orientation, religion, whatever it is, you have a choice. You can allow that bigot's negative view of you to become your own view, or you can define yourself for yourself and turn that bigotry back on the bigot. In other words, you don't let other people define you for you. You believe in yourself, you know your own worth, and you recognize that if you let somebody's negative perception of you become your own self-perception, then the bigot is won. And you have consumed a huge amount of mental space and energy with your own self-doubt, which is therefore not mental space and capacity to go do what you're trying to do. So my father had a saying that beyond don't take crap off of people, which is, if my being black is going to be a problem, it's going to be a problem for somebody else, not for me. And that really was how he came from where he came from and rose to be a governor of the Federal Reserve. He built up this psychological armor. And it took years, and it's not easy. It's like building muscle. And you can't let that muscle atrophy. You got to work it, because it's a psychological jujitsu. You just refuse to let other people's negative definition of you become your own self-definition. And so my parents taught me and my brother that from a very early age. We developed those mental muscles early. And so, by the time I was a young African-American woman, on the NSC staff or in the State Department, where arguably, people felt I didn't belong, I was not unconscious of those perceptions, but I refused to let it cause me to think that I couldn't. And so it's a real challenge, but it's a hugely important lesson that my parents taught me, and it served me extremely well.
Obviously.
Thank you.
Great question. This will be the last question, right? This is the last question? Anybody else?
Okay.
Tony, are you asking a question, or are you just helping?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I thought. Okay. Last question.
Yeah,
So now it's got to be really good. No, I'm just kidding.
First, I'd like to thank you for your talk. And I'd also wanted to ask, given your work in the Obama administration during the...
He's too tall. There you go.
Given your work in the Obama administration during the Egyptian Revolution, how do you feel about the potential designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization?
I think we need to be very careful with that, because the Muslim Brotherhood and the range of people who identify either directly or indirectly with that perspective is not a monolith. It's just very diverse. And we have lots of friends in the Gulf and indeed in Cairo who are very keen to have the United States be the ones to validate their unique form of sectarianism within their Sunni world. And there are elements of extremists, obviously, within the Brotherhood, and there are elements that are using politics and the process to achieve their aims. And we have to be able to make that distinction. And I think that the impulse to designate the Brotherhood is born of one, to paint them all with the same brush. And I think that could come back to haunt us in various parts of the region. So I would approach that with caution.
Thank you.
It's up to Susan.
Sure.
Real quick.
He's got a book. Look at him.
He's got a book. All right.
A lot of folks write books, go on book tours. I think there was some discussion about you possibly running for Senate in Maine one time. Could there be some inclination on your part to run for public office in the near future?
Thank you.
You let him speak, not me.
I did. I'm not running for Senate in Maine in 2020, but I have not ruled out serving again if I thought that there were a way for me to do it. Whether that's in some kind of elective office or appointive office, I'm open-minded about that. If you read the book, though, you'll notice it's not a book written by somebody who's got a clear political ambition. It's a little bit too raw for that, and a little bit too personal, I think. So I leave that door open, but it's not, what I'm driving towards, and it's not my North Star by any way, shape, or form. One of the great things about leaving government, having had the privilege of serving at the highest levels under an extraordinary president, is that, I feel like if I hung up my cleats, it would be, with a record I'm proud of, and in service of a country and a president that I'm very proud to have served. So I'm good. And there's a lot I figured out when you get out again, there's a whole world out there. There's the private sector, there's the nonprofit world, there's tennis courts. And, it's all good. So thank you for asking.
Let's watch this space. How about that? So first, I just want to thank Stanford and government for doing this with FSI together.
And FSI.
It's always better when we have students. Second, I wasn't kidding about buying the book. I want you to buy the book.
Please buy the book.
And third, Susan, on behalf of our country, I want to thank you for your service. But on behalf of...
Thank you. And Mike, thank you for your service.
Come on now. But I also want to thank you for being such a great Stanford alum. There is this, I'm going to squeeze it in right now. There is this beautiful Stanford moment. Foreign policy meets Stanford, meets the Rice-Cameron family. Osama bin Laden is killed. I remember that day. I was working at the White House. And you guys turn on All Right Now and dance to All Right Now on that moment. And you talk about the nuance in here, but to me, that was just the classic bringing together of the different pieces of your life. We are so proud that you are part of Stanford University, and we're
Thank you.
so thankful that you came to speak to us.
I love
today.
this place. Thank you. Thanks, honey.
Thanks, fun. That was great.